over 200,000 federal workers have left their job this year. More will probably leave during the summer months. But it's not just this year, because we're seeing plans to cut over 100,000 jobs in 2026, next year. Why is this happening? Let's get into it. The Trump administration released its 2026 budget last week, and it wants to slash a net total of 107,000 jobs. Now, net total means that some agencies will not be cut and others will be cut. So as you know, some agencies are going to grow during this time period. If you look at Border Patrol or the Department of Transportation with the FAA, they need air traffic controllers. Or the Bureau of Prisons, they need to keep hiring those correctional workers. Also, when we're talking about this budget, DOD, Department of Defense, and the Veteran Affairs, their numbers are not included. As you know, they want to fire tens of thousands of workers in those agencies. So the actual number will probably be higher than 107,000. Now, there's a little bit of confusion when it comes to what does this mean? Does this mean all mandatory force outs, RIFs? Or does this also mean the voluntary incentive when it comes to the early retirement, when the separation pay, when the deferred resignation program? Does it include that as well? And from my understanding it is a comprehensive number. It includes from both categories. The mandatory force outs, the reduction in forces, the layoffs, and also the voluntary resignations when it comes to the separation payments. So when the VA says we want to cut 80,000 jobs, if you have 20,000 people that are leaving on their own accord, that are either retiring or taking a buyout of some type, then in reality, the RIF should really only impact 60,000. All right, let's see who's going to get hit the hardest when it comes to these cuts. Let's pull up a chart here. As you can see, the Department of Education is facing the biggest cut. They're losing a third of its workforce, over 1,000 people. Next is the Office of Personnel Management, GSA, NASA, and even the Small Business Administration is taking a big hit. Those will be the hardest hit federal agencies. But we also have offices that are taking even a bigger hit within agencies, like the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're losing 2/3 of their workforce, and what they typically do is they help farmers and they track water resources. But not every agency is shrinking. We got some winners here, and we touched on this just a little while ago. Department of Transportation, we're going to see FAA grow a little bit, at least that's the intent. And a lot of sub-agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. So ICE, anything really with immigration, aside from anything that has to do with asylum, yeah, that's out. But if it's immigration enforcement, if it's Border Patrol, CBP officers, that's in, that's growing. And we could see the incentives to hire those individuals, they could increase. But there are other sub-agencies within DHS that will be hurting. FEMA is losing 13% of its staff, and the TSA is cutting 6%. Throughout the federal agencies, we're also seeing reorganization. We're seeing the shuffle, where you take one office from one agency, you pull it out like it's a Lego block, and then you shove it into another agency. That is causing complete teams to get fired. And if they're fired that way, let's say you're in the Department of Labor and your office gets dissolved, right? If they say it's dissolved, but in reality it's being moved, then you should have reinstatement rights where they consider you, they at least give you an opportunity to apply to your job that you just lost. Because the job didn't go away, it's simply the office moved from your agency to another agency. Some offices are getting wiped out, like the USDA's Research and State Forestry Office, NASA's STEM Engagement Office, and the IRS's Business System Modernization Office. And when you take a look at HHS, they're cutting 10 complete offices. They're just getting rid of 10 whole offices. They're just gone like that. Now, when it comes to these numbers, the cuts that have already happened, they're not necessarily factored in to what's being planned here. So the number's not accurate is the main thing, right? So the White House said this: figures may not reflect all of management and administrative actions underway or planned in federal agencies. The massive layoff plan, or the RIF, reduction in force plan, that's still paused as of right now. You had a judge over at San Francisco, they placed an injunction. The court placed an injunction. Then the appeal court sustained it. Now it's going to the Supreme Court. So we're going to have to see how that plays out. If these RIFs are allowed to continue, then the overall number for next year is going to be impacted. It'll probably be a lot less than 107,000. Now, here's another thing that should be considered. The agencies, in my view, are not naturally, they're not organically looking at their organization and saying, we should reduce here, we should reduce there. This is really being led by the Trump administration, by DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. This is efforts being led by them to reduce the total size of the federal workforce. So it might not necessarily be in the best interest of the public, and that's what the courts are there for. That's what they're going to figure out. Now, over at the Veteran Affairs, the administration is trying to reverse President Biden's growth. This is why they want to get rid of 80,000 workers. And some of these cuts could negatively impact veterans. Jonathan, a former VA tech advisor, recently told Congress that these cuts are leaving the VA's website, va.gov, vulnerable. This site handles sensitive information, talking about your medical information if you're a veteran, talking about your financial information. This is information you don't want just willy-nilly floating around in the public. He said the IT team is already stretched thin, and losing 1,000 more people could put veterans' data at risk from hackers. You wouldn't think it, at least I don't think it, but when we're envisioning international hacking groups from Russia, China, Iran, trying to breach U.S. government systems, probably don't think about the VA. You probably think about other agencies. But the VA is a target. Millions of attempts each month go through the VA system trying to break into their system and steal data. Why? Well, the first reason is that sweet PII. That personal identifiable information, your birth dates, your names, all that information. The second reason, there's a financial incentive, right? They want your account information. They want your banking account. The VA holds millions of veteran records such as names, social security numbers, birth dates, and addresses. It's just what you need to get a fake ID, maybe open up a credit card account, or maybe even try to get a financial loan. And then there's additional financial reasons. The VA processes disability and pension payments, home loans, educational benefits. So a hacker could make efforts and try to reroute some of these payments. And in 2020, there was a data breach that impacted tens of thousands of veterans. So it's not such a far-fetched scenario that this could happen in 2025 and beyond. The DoD is also aiming to cut tens of thousands of jobs. But here's the thing. The Pentagon doesn't want to tell us how many people accepted the deferred resignation program. People want to know. People that are in jeopardy of getting cut by a RIF, they want to know. How secure are they? But just like other agencies, it's very tight-lipped. It's like a state secret. It's like top secret information. You can't let it out. You can't even give a hint of how many people have accepted the deferred resignation program. Apparently, allegedly, they're working on this big reveal. They're supposedly going to release a defense budget later this month. Maybe they include the number of how many people accepted the DRP. Maybe they don't. The Trump administration says it's about efficiency, cutting waste, and making the government leaner. President Trump's budget argues that the federal agencies are too big. They're bloated. The government's too big. It's been growing too much over the decades. And these cuts will streamline it. It'll make everything so much more efficient, and it will not hurt public service. Now, here's the thing. If the government's too big right now, join me in thinking about this, okay? I want you to close your eyes or leave them open, doesn't matter. Picture Donald Trump as a baby. He was a little bitty baby. He was in a crib, right? At that moment in time, as he's crying, whining, or sleeping in his crib, the government was larger then than it is now. A lot larger. And now the pushback is, well, it was during World War II. Of course, how dare you compare the size of the government during World War II? Don't you realize the world was at war? And okay, I'll give you that. Not a problem. Makes sense. Good argument. But let me push back and say, let's add 10 years to that. Okay, let's go to 1955. The government still, in 1955, is larger than it was at the start of the year. This year, 2025. And we have many critics arguing that the cuts could cripple essential services. Let's look at the VA again. They've claimed that they've made a cut, 25% to their disability claim backlog, which is a great thing, and we should celebrate it. That's a good job, VA. But you are also seeing workers over there being forced to do overtime. So they're forcing them to do overtime. Simultaneously, they're cutting thousands from the VBA, at least 2,000. They're cutting from the VBA. The same individuals that will be working on these claims that they need to pull the overtime lever to get accomplished. So the situation seems kind of backwards. Why force people out? Why fire people while at the same time you're forcing people to do overtime? These 107,000 federal workers, federal employees, civil servants, these individuals, they applied to a job that was open. Why was it open? It was open because Congress allocated the money to support that fund. They had supporting documentation to create that job position. And then Americans like you, like me, like your neighbors, they stood up, they raised their hand, they took the oath of office, they applied for that job, and they started working in that capacity to benefit the greater good. And now they're being painted with the brush of a villain, of this is what is wrong with the country. This is excessive waste. Why is all the energy and effort being laser focused at the civil servant, at the GS9, at the GS11, who's working at a cubicle, who's pulling maybe 60, 70, 80,000 a year? Is that really the nation's enemy at this particular point? That's what I'm hearing. That's when I go through some of the comments. That's what I'm seeing. Okay, so what happens next? The budget's out, but it's not final. Congress has to approve a lot of these cuts. And we also have to still consider what's happening over at the Supreme Court. What I think will happen, it'll probably take weeks, if not months. What I think will ultimately happen is I do believe the Supreme Court will uphold the injunction of the lower court. And they will, at a minimum, they'll force the agencies to resubmit RIF plans that actually make sense, that you can actually justify, that you can prove will not hurt service to the public. And until that happens, really a lot of the government will be in a holding pattern. They'll still offer the early retirements at a lot of agencies. You might even see another DRP, another deferred resignation program come out. If you want to know more about how the RIF situation is going, the latest update, how that whole thing is holding up over there, if you're interested in that, check this video out next. Stay updated by signing up to the free newsletter down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.